New beginnings. The sun hung high over Maplewood Drive, casting a golden glow on the quiet suburban neighborhood. The air was fresh with the scent of blooming magnolias, and the hum of cicadas blended with the occasional laughter of children playing in their yards. On this picturesque Saturday afternoon, the Marshall family, James, his wife Anita, and their two children, Mia and Jaden, were hosting a backyard barbecue to celebrate their recent move. James Marshall stood over the grill, his tall frame silhouetted against the afternoon sun. The sizzle of burgers and ribs filled the air, mingling with the aroma of seasoned vegetables and cornbread. James was a confident man in his early 40s, his smile warm and his laugh easy. His wife, Anita, was setting up a tray of lemonade on the picnic table. Her vibrant personality and infectious laugh lit up every gathering. Mia, their 10-year-old daughter, was helping her younger brother Jaden set up a sprinkler for an afternoon water fight. The Marshalls had spent years saving and working tirelessly to afford their new home in this peaceful neighborhood. Maplewood Drive symbolized a fresh start, a chance to build memories in a place they had long dreamed of calling their own. For James, who had recently been promoted to fire captain, and Anita, a beloved middle school teacher, this move was the culmination of years of hard work. Neighbors began to trickle in, drawn by the tantalizing smell of barbecue and the sound of cheerful music. Anita greeted them warmly, introducing herself and her family with her trademark enthusiasm. James offered firm handshakes and hearty welcomes, making a genuine effort to get to know everyone. It was their first step in becoming part of the community. But not everyone was as welcoming. 2 houses down, behind closed blinds, Helen Stafford sat in her living room, her eyes fixed on the Marshalls' backyard. At 68 years old, Helen had lived on Maplewood Drive for nearly 4 decades. The neighborhood, with its manicured lawns and quiet streets, had always been her sanctuary. To her, the arrival of the Marshalls threatened that sanctuary. New people bringing their noise and disruption, Helen muttered, setting down her tea. She watched as more guests arrived, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses grating on her nerves. Helen had always prided herself on keeping the neighborhood in order, often policing everything from lawn lengths to the number of cars parked on driveways. The Marshalls' lively barbecue was, in her mind, a breach of that order. The sight of Mia and Jaden playing with water balloons while guests mingled and enjoyed themselves only fueled Helen's indignation. They should know better, she muttered, picking up her phone. Helen dialed a familiar number, her voice clipped as she spoke to the dispatcher. "Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance. There's a loud party on Maplewood Drive, and it's getting out of hand," she said. "You need to send someone over right away." The dispatcher assured her that an officer would respond shortly. Satisfied, Helen returned to her perch by the window, a smug smile tugging at her lips. Back at the barbecue, James was deep in conversation with one of his new neighbors, a kind-hearted man named Tom, who worked as a mechanic. They bonded over shared stories of long work hours and raising kids. Meanwhile, Anita had struck up a lively discussion with a couple of women about the best local parks for children. The Marshalls' warmth was contagious, and many of the neighbors were quickly won over. As the afternoon wore on, Jaden squealed with delight as Mia managed to drench him with a well-aimed water balloon. Guests chuckled, enjoying the carefree energy that filled the yard. Everything seemed perfect until James noticed a police car pulling up to the curb in front of their house. The atmosphere shifted. Conversations quieted, and the laughter faded. James's instincts as a fire captain kicked in, and he immediately tried to assess the situation. He set down the spatula, wiped his hands on a towel, and walked toward the front yard. Anita followed, her brow furrowed with concern. The officer, a young man named Officer Clark, stepped out of the vehicle. James recognized him from his work as a first responder. Clark had always seemed level-headed, but the tension in the air was undeniable. "Good afternoon, sir," Officer Clark said, his tone professional but not unfriendly. "We received a noise complaint about a gathering here. Just need to check things out." James nodded, his expression calm. Of course, officer. We're just having a family barbecue, nothing out of the ordinary. Please feel free to take a look around. Before Clark could respond, Helen appeared on the sidewalk, her arms crossed and her face twisted in disapproval. That's them, she said sharply, pointing toward the marshal's yard. They've been making noise all afternoon, and it's disturbing the whole neighborhood. James clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain composed. He had dealt with people like Helen before. Anita placed a reassuring hand on his arm, her presence grounding him. Ma'am, Officer Clark began, his voice measured, from what I can see, this is a peaceful gathering. There doesn't appear to be any disturbance. Helen's face reddened. You call this peaceful? Loud music, kids running wild, and strangers coming in and out. This is a quiet neighborhood, and they're ruining it. The guests had fallen silent, their attention now focused on the unfolding confrontation. Mia and Jaden watched from the edge of the yard, their smiles replaced with confusion and unease. James took a step forward, his voice steady but firm. Mrs. Stafford, I understand that you value peace and quiet, but we've been nothing but respectful. This barbecue is our way of introducing ourselves to the community. We're here to be good neighbors, not cause trouble. Helen scoffed, her gaze cold. We'll see how long that lasts, she muttered, turning her back and walking away. Officer Clark looked at James apologetically. I'm sorry about this, Captain Marshall. It's clear there's no issue here. I'll report back that everything is under control. Thank you, officer, James said, shaking Clark's hand. As the police car drove away, the guests began to relax, though the incident lingered in the air like an unwelcome shadow. James turned to Anita, who gave him a small smile. We'll get through this, she said softly. He nodded, wrapping an arm around her. This is our home now, he said. We're not going anywhere. As the barbecue resumed, the Marshalls' resolve only grew stronger. They knew that this was just the beginning of their journey in Maplewood Drive. What lay ahead would test their patience, their courage, and their belief in the power of community. But for now, they focused on what mattered most, each other. The cracks in the facade. The morning after the barbecue, James Marshall sat at the kitchen table sipping his coffee, his mind replaying the previous day's events. The way Helen Stafford's words had cut through the joyous atmosphere of the gathering still gnawed at him. He could sense the subtle undercurrent of doubt it had left in some of his neighbors. Anita noticed his pensive expression as she placed a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him. Stop brooding over it, James, she said gently, sliding into the chair across from him. One sour person doesn't define this neighborhood. James smiled faintly, appreciating her optimism. I know, Anita. But it's not just about her. It's about what she represents. There's this assumption that we don't belong here. I want to change that. Anita reached out, placing her hand over his. We will. One step at a time. The sound of footsteps interrupted them as Mia and Jaden bounded into the kitchen. Their laughter was like sunlight breaking through a cloud. Dad! We need to go to the park today. Jaden says he's going to beat me at soccer, but he's dreaming. Mia declared, grinning at her younger brother. I am not. Jaden protested, puffing out his chest. I've been practicing, and you're going down. James chuckled, grateful for the distraction. All right. Let me finish my coffee, and we'll head out. At Maplewood Park, the Marshalls found themselves surrounded by families enjoying the sunny day. Parents pushed toddlers on swings, teens played basketball, and a group of older residents gathered for a leisurely game of chess under the pavilion. James and Anita watched as Mia and Jaden joined a group of kids for an impromptu soccer match. They're already making friends, Anita said, her voice tinged with pride. James nodded, his eyes scanning the park. He noticed Helen Stafford sitting on a bench with two other women, her expression as sharp as ever. Their eyes met briefly before she looked away, leaning in to whisper something to her companions. James sighed, the moment a stark reminder that not everyone shared his family's enthusiasm for new connections. "Ignore her," Anita said, following his gaze. "She's not worth your energy." But James couldn't ignore the way Helen's disdain seemed to ripple outward. He saw the hesitant smiles from some of the other parents, the way a few pulled their children closer when Mia and Jaden joined the game. It wasn't overt, but it was there, a subtle question mark hanging over their presence. Later that afternoon, back at the house, James decided it was time to take proactive steps. He gathered his family in the living room. "I've been thinking," he began. "We can't let one person's negativity define our experience here. If we want to build a sense of community, we need to show people who we really are. Let them see what we're about." "What do you have in mind?" Anita asked, intrigued. "A block party," James said, his eyes lighting up with determination. "Something for the entire neighborhood. Music, food, games for the kids. Let's give everyone a reason to come together." Anita grinned. "I like it. And it'll show them that we're not just here to stay, we're here to contribute." "Can we have a bounce house?" Jaden asked excitedly. "And face painting," Mia added. James laughed. "We'll see what we can do." The following week, the marshals set to work planning the event. James and Anita went door to door, handing out flyers and personally inviting their neighbors. The responses were mixed. Many expressed enthusiasm, while others offered polite but non-committal nods. Helen Stafford, predictably, refused to open her door when they knocked. "Don't let it get to you," Anita reminded James as they walked back to their house. "This isn't about changing her mind. It's about building something bigger than her pettiness." James nodded, though Helen's rejection stung more than he wanted to admit. He channeled his frustration into organizing the best block party Maplewood Drive had ever seen. As the day of the party approached, the marshal's yard transformed into a hub of activity. Tables and chairs were set up, colorful streamers and balloons adorned the fence, and a local DJ volunteered to provide music. Anita coordinated with neighbors who offered to bring dishes, creating a diverse menu that reflected the neighborhood's cultural mix. James rented a bounce house, much to Jaden's delight, and set up a face painting station for Mia's suggestion. The kids spent hours helping their parents prepare, their excitement infectious. When the day arrived, the marshals were up early, putting the final touches on the setup. The first guests began to trickle in by mid-morning, and soon the yard was filled with laughter and conversation. Children raced around with balloons, parents mingled over plates of food, and the music added a festive energy to the air. James took a moment to stand back and observe the scene. His heart swelled with pride as he watched neighbors who had barely exchanged greetings before now laughing together like old friends. It was exactly what he had envisioned. But not everyone shared the joy. Helen Stafford stood on her porch, her arms crossed and her face set in a scowl. Despite the warmth of the day, she radiated a chill that seemed to reach across the street. James noticed her and, after a moment of hesitation, decided to approach. He grabbed a plate of food and made his way over, determined to extend an olive branch. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Stafford," he said, offering his brightest smile. "Thought I'd bring you something from the party. We've got plenty to share." Helen looked at the plate as though it were a live grenade. "I don't need your food," she snapped. "And I don't appreciate the noise." James's smile faltered, but he refused to let her attitude ruin the day. "I understand. But we'd love for you to join us, even just for a little while. It's a chance to meet everyone and enjoy some good company." Helen's eyes narrowed. "I know your type. You come in, disrupt everything, and then act like you're doing us all a favor. I've seen it before." James felt a surge of anger but kept his voice steady. "Mrs. Stafford, I can't change what you think you know about me. But I can show you who we really are. All I'm asking is for a chance. Helen said nothing, her gaze hard and unyielding. James sighed, placing the plate on a small table near her door. If you change your mind, the invitation's open, he said before walking back to the party. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the block party showed no signs of slowing down. Neighbors who had once been strangers now exchanged stories and laughter, their shared experiences bridging divides. For James and Anita, it was a small but meaningful victory. From her porch, Helen watched the scene unfold, her expression unreadable. The distant sound of laughter and music carried on the breeze, filling the silence around her. For the first time in a long while, she felt an uncomfortable pang of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger or annoyance, but something far more unsettling, doubt. The morning after the block party, James Marshall stood in the front yard, surveying the remnants of the celebration. Deflated balloons hung limply from the fence, and folding chairs stood in clusters like soldiers at ease. The yard bore the signs of a successful gathering, but James's mind lingered on Helen Stafford's cold dismissal. He had done his best to reach out, but her wall of prejudice seemed impenetrable. Anita joined him, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She handed one to James and sipped hers while leaning against the fence. The party was a success, she said with a smile. Everyone had a great time. Well, almost everyone. Anita nudged him playfully. Because you're stubborn, just like her. But I'll tell you something, even the most stubborn people can surprise you. James raised an eyebrow. You think she's going to wake up one day and decide we're not so bad after all? Anita shrugged, a twinkle in her eye. Stranger things have happened. Besides, we're not doing this for her. We're doing it for us, and for the neighbors who want to see this community thrive. James nodded, her words settling something in his chest. He turned back to the yard. All right. Let's get this cleaned up. The kids can help when they wake up. 2 doors down, Helen Stafford watched the Marshalls from her window. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of tea, but she hadn't taken a sip. She'd barely slept, her mind restless with thoughts of the previous day. She hated to admit it, but the block party had been, well organized. The laughter and music, though louder than she would have liked, had carried an infectious energy that even she couldn't entirely ignore. Helen's gaze fell on James as he moved chairs and picked up stray decorations. Despite her reservations, she couldn't help but admire his persistence. He had approached her with kindness, even after she'd made her disapproval abundantly clear. And then there was Anita, whose genuine warmth had shone through every interaction. Helen shook her head, as if to dispel the creeping doubt. No, she muttered to herself. They're just putting on a show. It won't last. But even as she tried to convince herself, a part of her wasn't so sure. The next few weeks passed without incident. The Marshalls settled further into the neighborhood, their interactions with other residents growing warmer and more frequent. James started a morning jogging routine, often exchanging greetings with fellow early risers. Anita joined a local book club, quickly endearing herself to its members with her thoughtful insights and humor. Mia and Jaden made fast friends at school, their laughter often echoing through the yard as they played with their new companions. One Saturday morning, as James was tinkering with the lawnmower in the garage, he heard a voice call out to him. He turned to see Tom, his mechanic neighbor, standing at the edge of the driveway. "Need a hand?" Tom asked, nodding toward the lawnmower. James grinned. "If you know anything about these things, I'd appreciate it. It's been acting up all week." Tom walked over, crouching beside the machine. As they worked together, their conversation flowed easily, covering everything from family life to favorite barbecue recipes. By the time they'd fixed the mower, it felt like they'd known each other for years. "Thanks, Tom," James said, wiping his hands on a rag. "I owe you one." Tom waved him off. "Don't mention it. That's what neighbors are for." From her porch, Helen watched the interaction, her lips pressing into a thin line. She'd always liked Tom. A dependable man who'd lived on Maplewood Drive for over a decade. Seeing him so at ease with James stirred something uncomfortable in her. It was harder to cling to her assumptions when someone like Tom seemed to accept the Marshalls without hesitation. That evening, as Helen watered her plants, she spotted Anita walking toward her with a covered dish in her hands. Helen's first instinct was to retreat inside, but something held her in place. "Good evening, Mrs. Stafford," Anita said, her smile as warm as ever. "I made some peach cobbler and thought you might like some." Helen hesitated, her fingers tightening around the watering can. "I don't need charity," she said curtly. Anita's smile didn't falter. "It's not charity. It's cobbler. And I promise it's good." After a long pause, Helen sighed and reached out to take the dish. "Thank you," she said stiffly, avoiding Anita's gaze. "You're welcome," Anita replied. "Have a good evening." As Anita walked away, Helen glanced down at the dish in her hands. The aroma of warm peaches and cinnamon wafted up, evoking memories of her own mother's baking. For a moment, she felt a pang of something she hadn't experienced in years: connection. The following day, Helen found herself at the park, her usual bench shaded by a large oak tree. She brought a book but couldn't focus on the words. Instead, she watched as the Marshalls played soccer with a group of kids. James's laughter boomed across the field as he let Jaden score a goal, much to the boys' delight. Anita cheered them on, her voice ringing clear and bright. Helen's gaze softened, though she would never admit it. She couldn't deny the joy radiating from the family. It was infectious, seeping into the air and touching everyone around them. Even her. For the first time, Helen allowed herself to wonder if she'd been wrong. Maybe, just maybe, the Marshalls weren't the disruption she'd feared. Maybe they were exactly what the neighborhood needed. Back at home that evening, Helen sat at her kitchen table, the empty cobbler dish in front of her. She stared at it for a long time, her thoughts a jumble of conflicting emotions. Finally, she stood and walked to her pantry, pulling out a bag of flour and a tin of baking powder. As she measured and mixed, a small smile played at the corners of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The walls began to crumble. By the time autumn leaves began to scatter across Maplewood Drive, the Marshalls had cemented themselves as active members of the neighborhood. Anita's involvement in the local book club led to her organizing a monthly discussion group for parents at the local library. James, with his easy charm and willingness to lend a hand, became the go-to person for minor household repairs. Even Mia and Jaden had blossomed in school, their laughter often echoing in the streets as they raced bicycles with friends. For Helen Stafford, the changes in her neighborhood were impossible to ignore. While she clung to her routine, watering her plants, reading her paper, and keeping her interactions minimal, she found herself observing the Marshalls more and more. Each small gesture chipped away at her carefully built wall of assumptions, though she'd never admit it to anyone, not even herself. One brisk afternoon, Helen stood on her porch, a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders, watching as James and Tom worked to clear a fallen tree branch from the road. A recent storm had left debris scattered across the neighborhood, and James had taken it upon himself to help where he could. "Watch your hands, Tom," James said, his voice carrying. "This branch is heavier than it looks." "Got it," Tom replied, grunting as they maneuvered the branch to the curb. Helen couldn't help but notice the camaraderie between the two men. It wasn't just polite, it was genuine. As the pair finished their task, James glanced toward Helen's porch and gave a friendly wave. Taken by surprise, she hesitated before offering a stiff nod in return. The small interaction lingered in her thoughts long after she retreated inside. Later that week, Helen's routine was interrupted when her neighbor Nancy, a chatty woman in her 60s who lived across the street, knocked on her door. Helen opened it reluctantly, bracing herself for one of Nancy's long-winded updates. "Morning, Helen," Nancy said cheerfully, holding a basket of apples. Got these from the farmer's market and thought you might like some. That's very kind, Helen replied, taking the basket with a polite smile. Thank you. Nancy's gaze drifted toward the marshal's house. Did you hear about the school fundraiser Anita's organizing? She's got half the neighborhood involved. It's incredible, really. Helen's brow furrowed. A fundraiser? Oh yes, Nancy said, nodding enthusiastically. It's for new playground equipment at the elementary school. They're hosting a fall festival next weekend. I'm baking pies for the bake sale, what about you? Helen stiffened. I'm not much of a baker these days. Nonsense, Nancy said, undeterred. I remember your apple turnovers from last year's block party. You should make some. Before Helen could respond, Nancy gave her a knowing smile. You should come, even if you don't bake. It's shaping up to be quite the event. As Nancy left, Helen closed the door and stared at the basket of apples in her hands. The thought of attending an event organized by the Marshalls made her uneasy, but a small part of her, the part she'd been trying to ignore, felt curious. The following weekend, Maplewood Drive buzzed with activity as the fall festival came to life. Colorful banners and strings of twinkling lights adorned the schoolyard, and the air was filled with the scent of cinnamon, caramel, and fresh popcorn. Children darted between game booths, their laughter mingling with the cheerful tunes of a local band. James manned the grill, flipping burgers and hot dogs with practiced ease, while Anita oversaw the bake sale table. Mia and Jaden were busy helping younger kids at the pumpkin painting station. Helen arrived quietly, lingering near the entrance. She'd told herself she was only there to observe, but as she took in the lively scene, she felt an unexpected warmth. It reminded her of the neighborhood events she used to enjoy years ago, before everything had seemed to change. Mrs. Stafford, a voice called out. Helen turned to see Anita approaching, her face lit with a genuine smile. I'm so glad you came. Helen forced a smile. It's quite the turnout. Isn't it? Anita said, her excitement palpable. Come, let me show you around. We have some amazing pies and cakes at the bake sale. You'll love them. Before Helen could decline, Anita gently guided her toward the table. As they walked, several neighbors greeted Helen warmly, their smiles disarming her usual defenses. At the bake sale, Nancy handed Helen a slice of pecan pie, insisting she try it. You've got to tell me if it's as good as last year's, Nancy said with a wink. To her surprise, Helen found herself laughing. It's excellent, she admitted after a bite. As the evening wore on, Helen found herself relaxing. She even joined a small group of neighbors in a ring toss game, her competitive streak emerging to the delight of those around her. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the festival in a golden glow, Helen realized she hadn't felt this connected to her community in years. James approached her as the event wound down, holding a plate of caramel apples. Mrs. Stafford, he said warmly, I didn't get a chance to thank you for coming. It means a lot. Helen hesitated, then offered a small smile. You've done a fine job here. The festival, I mean. It's impressive. James's grin widened. That means a lot coming from you. As Helen walked home that night, the cool autumn air filling her lungs, she felt a strange lightness. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that change wasn't always a bad thing. And maybe, just maybe, the Marshalls were part of something good. The next morning, Helen stood in her kitchen, a recipe book open on the counter. As she measured flour and sugar for apple turnovers, she thought about the look on Anita's face when she'd been greeted so warmly at the festival. It wasn't just hospitality, it was hope. A hope that their family's presence could foster something better. By the time the turnovers were in the oven, Helen found herself humming a tune she hadn't thought of in years. Change might be slow, she realized, but it was happening. And for the first time, she was willing to be part of it. Bridges built over time. The days after the fall festival brought an unexpected shift in Maplewood Drive's dynamics. Helen Stafford's cautious attendance had not gone unnoticed by the neighborhood. Though she had remained reserved, her willingness to engage, even slightly, felt like a turning point. James and Anita Marshall had sensed it too, though they chose not to push. Change, they knew, was better cultivated gently. For Helen, the change came in subtle waves. Where once she had avoided the Marshalls' friendly greetings, she now offered brief nods and the occasional polite remark. She even returned Anita's cobbler dish with a batch of her apple turnovers, muttering something about not wanting to leave debts unpaid. Anita had accepted them with such genuine delight that Helen couldn't help but feel a twinge of pride. One crisp Saturday morning, as Helen raked leaves in her front yard, she saw James emerge from his house, a toolbox in hand. He made his way toward her driveway, pausing at the edge of her lawn. "Good morning, Mrs. Stafford," he called, his tone as warm as the sunlight filtering through the trees. "Mind if I fix that loose gutter of yours? I noticed it's been sagging since the last storm." Helen straightened, clutching her rake. "I've been meaning to get to it," she said, her tone clipped. "No rush," James replied with an easy smile. "But I've got my tools out, and it's no trouble at all." Helen hesitated, torn between pride and practicality. Finally, she gave a curt nod. "If you insist." James set to work without another word, his movements efficient and practiced. Helen watched from the porch, her rake idle in her hands. She was struck by his quiet diligence, the way he handled the task without expectation of thanks or acknowledgement. When he finished, he wiped his hands on a rag and stepped back to admire his work. "That should hold through the winter," he said, turning to Helen. "Let me know if it gives you any more trouble." Helen cleared her throat. "Thank you," she said stiffly. "I appreciate it." James nodded, tipping an imaginary hat. "Any time." Later that afternoon, Helen found herself in her kitchen, preparing a pot of chicken soup. As the aroma filled the room, she glanced at the clock. Without allowing herself too much time to overthink, she ladled some soup into a container, grabbed a loaf of fresh bread, and made her way to the Marshall's house. Anita answered the door, her expression lighting up with surprise and pleasure. "Mrs. Stafford. What a lovely surprise." Helen thrust the container and bread forward. "I made too much soup," she said brusquely. "Thought you might like some." Anita's smile widened. "That's so thoughtful of you. Please, come in." Helen hesitated on the threshold, but Anita's warmth was impossible to resist. She stepped inside, noting the cozy decor and the faint sound of children's laughter coming from the backyard. "Would you like some tea?" Anita offered, already moving toward the kitchen. "I suppose I could stay for a cup," Helen said, her tone softening. As they sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea and chatting, Helen found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. Anita's genuine kindness was disarming, and Helen was surprised by how easy the conversation flowed. They spoke of everything from recipes to gardening tips, avoiding heavier topics that might have cast a shadow over the moment. When Helen finally left, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting the street in a warm, golden glow. She walked home with a strange sense of lightness, as though some invisible weight had been lifted. Over the next few weeks, Helen's interactions with the Marshalls became more frequent. She found herself waving to Mia and Jaden as they played outside, and she even offered a few gardening tips to James when she saw him planting bulbs in the front yard. One day, she spotted Mia struggling to carry a heavy box from the car. Without thinking, Helen crossed the street to help. "What's in here, bricks?" Helen joked as she took the other end of the box. Mia giggled. "It's art supplies for school. Mom's helping with the holiday decorations." Together, they carried the box into the house, where Anita greeted Helen with her usual warmth. "You're a lifesaver, Mrs. Stafford." "Nonsense," Helen replied, though the compliment warmed her more than she cared to admit. As winter approached, Maplewood Drive transformed into a scene from a holiday postcard. Strings of lights adorned houses, and wreaths hung on nearly every door. The Marshalls hosted a tree-trimming party, inviting the neighborhood to join them in decorating their massive pine tree. Helen had initially declined the invitation, but as the evening wore on, she found herself drawn to the sound of carols and laughter. When she arrived, the sight was almost magical. The tree sparkled with ornaments and lights, and neighbors mingled with mugs of hot cocoa in hand. Mia and Jaden were helping younger kids hang ornaments, their joy infectious. Anita spotted Helen and hurried over. "You came," she exclaimed, her excitement genuine. Helen offered a small smile. "I thought I'd see what all the fuss was about." Before she knew it, Helen was handed a mug of cocoa and ushered toward the tree. She even hung a few ornaments herself, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in years. By the end of the evening, she was chatting easily with neighbors she'd once kept at arm's length. That night, as Helen sat in her living room, the glow of her own modest tree casting soft shadows on the walls, she reflected on the changes in her life. The Marshalls had brought a new energy to the neighborhood, one that she'd resisted at first but had come to appreciate. They had shown her that connection and kindness could bridge even the deepest divides. For the first time in a long while, Helen felt hopeful. And as snow began to fall gently outside, she allowed herself a rare smile, knowing that the best gifts weren't always wrapped in paper and bows. Sometimes, they came in the form of neighbors who refused to give up on building a community, one small act of kindness at a time. A community transformed. The snow on Maplewood Drive glistened like powdered diamonds under the morning sun. Children's footprints and sled tracks crisscrossed the yards, evidence of recent snowball fights and hastily constructed snowmen. The Marshalls' house, with its glowing string lights and cheerful wreath, stood as a centerpiece of the neighborhood's festive spirit. But the transformation of Maplewood Drive wasn't just cosmetic, it was rooted in the bonds that had grown stronger over the past months. Helen Stafford, once the neighborhood's self-appointed gatekeeper, had found herself in the midst of this change. The walls she had so carefully built were no longer as sturdy, and to her surprise, she was okay with that. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged to something larger than her own carefully maintained routines. On Christmas Eve, the neighborhood buzzed with activity as families prepared for a communal potluck dinner hosted in the local community center. It was Anita's idea, and she had enlisted the help of nearly every household to make it happen. Helen's initial skepticism about the event had faded as she found herself drawn into the planning. "I'll bring a batch of turnovers," she'd told Anita during one of their many tea chats. "And maybe some ginger cookies." Anita had beamed at the offer. "That's wonderful, Mrs. Stafford. Your turnovers are legendary." On the morning of the potluck, Helen's kitchen was a flurry of activity. The scent of baking filled the air as she carefully packed her contributions into festive tins. When she arrived at the community center later that afternoon, James was there to greet her, carrying a tray of Anita's famous candied yams. "Let me take those for you," James offered, relieving Helen of her tins. "Thank you," she said, watching as he added her desserts to the growing buffet table. She marveled at the sight of neighbors coming together, each bringing a piece of themselves to the feast. For the first time, Helen felt pride in being part of this community. The evening was nothing short of magical. The room was filled with the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and the occasional cheer as children raced around the decorated hall. Helen found herself seated at a table with Anita, Nancy, and a few other neighbors. The conversation flowed easily, and Helen realized how much her perception of these people had shifted. Where she once saw outsiders, she now saw friends. "Try this," Anita said, passing Helen a plate of spiced roasted vegetables. "Tom brought it, and it's incredible." Helen took a bite and nodded approvingly. "It is. He's full of surprises." As the night wore on, James stood to give a short speech. The room quieted, and all eyes turned to him. "Thank you all for being here tonight," James began, his voice steady and warm. When Anita and I moved to Maplewood Drive, we hoped to find a community where our family could grow and thrive. What we found was something even better, a neighborhood filled with people willing to come together, support one another, and create something truly special. There was a round of applause, and James glanced toward Helen, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. Community isn't about everyone being the same, he continued. It's about embracing our differences, finding common ground, and building something stronger together. Tonight is proof of what we can accomplish when we do just that. The applause that followed was thunderous, and Helen found herself clapping along, her heart swelling with an unfamiliar warmth. After the potluck, as families began to gather their things and say their goodbyes, Anita approached Helen with a small gift bag. "This is for you," Anita said, her eyes sparkling. "A little something to say thank you for everything you've done." Helen opened the bag to find a handmade ornament in the shape of an apple, painted with the words, "Best Neighbor," in elegant script. She blinked back tears, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the ornament. "Thank you," Helen said softly. "I don't deserve this." "Of course you do," Anita replied, squeezing her hand. "You've done more than you realize to make this neighborhood what it is." Helen smiled, the last of her reservations melting away. "I'll treasure it." That night, as Helen placed the ornament on her tree, she reflected on how much had changed. Maplewood Drive was no longer just a street where she lived, it was a community she cared for deeply. And the Marshalls, once strangers she'd viewed with suspicion, had become an integral part of that transformation. For the first time in years, Helen felt truly at home. And as the clock struck midnight, ushering in Christmas Day, she sat by the glow of her tree, her heart full of gratitude and hope for the future. Sometimes, she thought with a smile, the best gifts aren't things at all. They're the people who teach us how to see the world, and ourselves, in a whole new light.